Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. This is Asadullah Ali Al-Andalusi of the Andalusian project coming at you again with another informal video. I've been getting a lot of requests lately for my conversion story to Islam, and I felt that it was about time to tell you guys how I converted to Islam. That said, I also felt it would be really important to kind of give you more of a backstory. And what I mean by that is kind of like a concise biography um, of my life to kind of just inform you not only of why I've converted, but how I got to the place that I am today and how I look at the world and why I look at the world the way that I do. Um, there's more to an individual than simply their ideas, but also their experiences. And even their ideas are often informed by those experiences. And in order for you guys to really understand how I converted and why I converted, you really need to understand that backstory. And if for you guys to really understand who I am as a person, as an individual, you should also know where I'm coming from before Islam. So, I want to tell you a little bit about my life as concisely as possible. And, I'll do my best not to rant or to go on tangents. That said, I can't guarantee anything. But where we should really start is not where I was born or when I was born, but prior to that. So I'd like to start off with my great grandparents, and this is going to be very brief, so don't worry. My great grandparents were Spaniards. They grew up in the southern province of Andalusia, Spain. And they eventually migrated to Puerto Rico, which is a U.S. territory. A lot of people don't know this, but Puerto Rico is not a separate country. It is autonomous, but it is largely a U.S. territory. So when you're a Puerto Rican citizen, you're also a U.S. citizen. Anyways, so they were very simple folk, farmers, and they came to Puerto Rico and they settled down there and they started their own life. And then they eventually had my grandparents in this very small Spanish migrant community in Puerto Rico. Okay? And my grandparents were also very simple people as well. My grandmother is largely uneducated. My grandfather is largely uneducated, though eventually he joined the U.S. military and fought in the Korean War. Made something a little bit more of himself as a result of that. So they were largely very simple people, and eventually my mother was born, my aunt was born, and so was my uncle. And then they wanted a better life for them as well, their children. So they all migrated to the mainland United States in New York. So during this time, my mother was very young, obviously, and it was during this period that there was a lot of prejudice and racial hatred towards Spanish immigrants in general, not simply Latin Americans, but also Spanish immigrants. And my mother lived during this time when there was a big scare against Spanish immigrants, and there was a lot of hatred towards Spanish immigrant communities. And I don't know if you've ever seen this famous movie called The West Side Story. It's a famous musical, but it largely centers around this sort of racial prejudice that was occurring during this time. West Side Story is a very good movie. You should see it anyway if you like watching movies. It's a musical about two rival gangs. One's a white gang and one is a Puerto Rican gang, and they're fighting for territory, and then somebody from the white gang falls in love with somebody from the Puerto Rican gang, and sort of like a Romeo and Juliet thing. Anyways, so my mom grew up during this period of time, and it largely influenced the way that she thought about things after that. And it influenced her in a lot of ways, and it really did traumatize her, actually, going through all this prejudice. And you're going to need to know that when we come later in the story. So anyways, eventually my grandparents and my mother and her siblings moved down to Florida, around Miami. And there my mother completed high school, and she didn't go to college. She was kind of I guess you could say not a party girl, but she wasn't really interested in education that much, and she just wanted to work. So, she became a airline stewardess, for a very famous airline at the time, and she lived her life and she enjoyed her life. Eventually, she met my father, and they fell in love, and then they got married, obviously. And after they got married, the honeymoon phase ended, and my mother realized who my father really was. And unfortunately, my father was a very abusive man. He was a very harsh man. He beat my mother considerably, severely, throughout their marriage. Um, they weren't married very long, and in fact, when my mother finally got pregnant with me, and I'm her only child, by the way, um, my father's abuse worsened during that period of time because my father didn't really want the what he would consider the financial burden of having a child. So he attempted to force a miscarriage on my mother. He actually punched her in the stomach several times when she was pregnant, even when she was almost done. Even though when I was almost, finished, about to be born, he did that. I think it was even at latest he did it was like around the seventh or eighth month. And you're probably wondering, well, why didn't my mom leave him? Well, it's not easy. If you've ever studied abuse victims, you'll know that a lot of women, even men, have a hard time leaving their spouses, even though they're being abused, because they really don't know where to go, and they've been so degraded, at a certain point that they just don't feel like there's anything better outside of that marriage. So my mom stayed with my father until I was born, and then eventually, because my mom loved me so much and she didn't want this life for me, she finally decided to divorce my father. So she finally summoned up the courage to leave my father. And that was a very difficult time for her and for me actually, because when she finally announced to my father that she didn't want to be with him anymore, he did something rather horrible. He actually kidnapped me. I know it sounds kind of weird because he's my father, so how can you kidnap me? But he actually took me away from my mom and moved somewhere else without her knowing or where we were. And for several months, I was basically missing, and the police couldn't do anything because legally I was still, he was still my father. So my family went and searched, my mom and my grandparents went and searched for me for several months until they found me like 3 months later. And when they found me, I was actually malnutritioned, and I was suffering from malnutrition, and I was suffering, and I had like bruises and everything, and they didn't know what happened. My father obviously didn't take care of me. He didn't care. And as a result of that, my father was jailed, and for neglect and abuse, and my mother took me away and eventually divorced him as a result. And during that time as well, she tried to get custody of me, and I remember the story clearly because my mom always told it to me. So basically, there was the first custody hearing, and my mom showed up for court, and my father didn't. He didn't even care. So she was automatically granted custody as a result of that. And yeah, that was it. So then my mom became a single mom, and she quit being an air stewardess, and she started working these other odd jobs until she settled on something. She became like a dental assistant, and she worked quite a lot, trying to raise me. So as a result of having to work all the time constantly, my grandparents largely took care of me during my childhood. And we lived in a really small house in Florida at the time, and like I said, my mom constantly was working, and my grandparents were taking care of me. My grandma was a housewife, and she took care of the house. And my grandfather at that time, he started working as a mechanic, and also as like this. He fixed like arcade machines, which was kind of cool actually. And that's kind of how I started also liking video games, because very early on, when I was young, I was introduced to like Pac-Man and Galaga, like on the actual arcade systems, so I actually get to play the arcades at my house because my grandfather would take them to the house to fix them, and I would be able to play it constantly. I wouldn't even have to put quarters in, he would just fix it, and then I could just play it constantly. So during the time that I was at the home, my mom wasn't there, or I wasn't at school, or daycare or whatever, because eventually I did go to these daycares later on when I became a little older. But anyways, so as I was at home when my mom was away, we used to play video games all the time, the arcade machines, and sometimes my grandpa would take me to the beaches, and we would catch like crabs, and take them home. My grandma would cook them and boil them, and we would eat them and things like this. And my grandpa would also grow sugarcane in the backyard, and we would wait till it got like tall enough, and then we would, cut it and eat it on the spot, fresh sugarcane. And that's how I lived as a child, mostly around my grandparents. And, it was interesting because my grandparents always spoke Spanish. And during that time, I actually spoke Spanish. I spoke a lot of Spanish, but it wasn't really encouraged. My mom didn't really encourage it because, as I said, she kind of went through a traumatic experience in her youth, with all the prejudice against Spanish people, Spanish immigrants. So when I was born, she gave me an English name. She didn't give me a Spanish name. She gave me an English name, and she kind of promised herself that I wouldn't learn Spanish because she didn't want me to be identified as a Spaniard or as a Latin American or an immigrant. She wanted me to be identified as an American because she didn't want me to go through the same thing she did. So she gave me an English name, and my English name was Kevin, for those of you who don't know. And she raised me to be white, basically. That's really what she wanted for me at the time. And even though she spoke Spanish with my grandparents and we lived in a very culturally Spanish household, I was generally raised in a non-Spanish manner. It's kind of weird. It's kind of hard to explain. But yeah, that's kind of what my mom encouraged me to be like from a very early age. And so it was I was a little confused in terms of my identity, but at the same time, I kind of understood the program, and I just went along with it. I was generally a very happy child. I didn't have any problems. Though when my mom started putting me in daycare to kind of give my grandparents a little bit more time to themselves and things like this, I had a very hard time because you have to understand, as an only child, single mom, I was also a little bit socially awkward as a child. And I was also very small as a child. I was not the same size as my peers, so I was actually quite short and tiny for my age throughout my youth. Compared to my peers, I was always the shorter or the smaller one. So I got picked on a lot. And we lived in a very poor area of town, so it wasn't exactly like a good place. And I used to get beat up all the time as a kid. All the time. And I was always very reserved too. Like I didn't like fighting. And so I didn't like getting into conflict. So I let the other kids bully me around because I didn't want to deal with it, And eventually my mom, being the way she is, she's a quite strong individual. She used to teach me, you need to stand up for yourself. It doesn't matter how big the other kids are. It doesn't matter how many of them are. You need to stand up for yourself and do what's right. Even if you see another kid getting beat up, you need to stand up for that person. So my mom instilled in me at a very early age that no matter what happens, no matter how much the odds are against me, I need to do the right thing. I need to stand up for what's just, for what's right. And because she instilled that in me, I was a very, I won't say rash, but very bold young kid. Like I was still very quiet at times and things, but when I saw something bad, I would stand up to these bullies, and I would face the consequences for it. So, I got beat up a lot, and it got so bad at one point that I don't know if you noticed this. There's like a scar right here. You see that? Okay, that scar I got around when I was 5 or 6 years old. And I remember I was in school and or in daycare, and I remember this bigger boy who had just like this big branch, right? And he literally beat me over the face with it, until I was just blood all over my face. And one of the things that I got from that was the scar, which I've had, for all of my life now, he literally like tore the hair off of my eyebrow. It was that bad. Um, and this continued, and my mom would take me from one daycare to another, but because we lived in such a bad part of town, the kids didn't get any better than this, and I really couldn't defend myself because I was so small, and I didn't have a father figure either to help teach me how to fight or anything, and my mom was working to take care of me and also my grandparents, and to help them out, and she didn't have enough money to like put me in any self-defense classes or anything, so we had to endure this for quite some time. Eventually, however, my mother did meet somebody. She had met my stepfather, and she remarried when I was around 8 years old, and this individual has remained my father since then. And when she remarried, this man had the decency to adopt me. So he actually adopted me after he married my mom, and I have been his legal son ever since. Alhamdulillah. And then after she remarried, you know, we moved out of that bad neighborhood and we moved to a better neighborhood. And my stepfather tried to give me and my mom a better life. Now, as I was growing up, however, even though we moved out of like that bad neighborhood, and we moved around a bit because my dad's job kind of demanded that, I was still kind of a small kid, socially awkward, and I was trying to adapt now to this new life situation where now I had a father, and I wasn't in like a rough neighborhood where there's like gangs and stuff everywhere, and I still was not well accepted with my peers, so I was still bullied quite a bit. But finally, my parents, got me into self-defense classes and things, and I joined this Taekwondo dojang, and so I started learning Taekwondo, and I found that I was very, 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 very good at it. And what I mean by very good is not that, I know how to do some kicks. Like, I was actually extremely good at it, as in I was winning tournaments at very early belts, and I was winning against higher belts than myself. And I started Taekwondo like early teens, around 15 or so. And I became extremely good as I went up ranks. And even to the point where I reached my black belt, I was beating everyone around me. So at a very early age, I was inducted into the Junior Olympics. And I was doing a practice tournament prior to that, training with my master, and it was during this time that that my life was going to change dramatically. And for those of you who don't know, I still practice martial arts. Before I get into this dramatic part of the story, I still practice martial arts to this day. I'm 32 now. I'm going to be 33 soon, and I still practice martial arts, and I still train and things like this, and I still consider myself quite good. Thankfully, I haven't had to get into many fights, in my elder years, but it's come in handy on a few occasions while I was traveling overseas. So, I've learned a lot from martial arts, and it helped to mold me as an individual and to discipline me and to make me a stronger person, both on the inside and outside. It took my thirst for justice and what my mom had taught me as a young child, and it really manifested itself in ways that I felt were very beneficial for me. And I even incorporated a lot of those teachings into my understanding of Islam, and how I see Islam as a force for justice in the world. And it was one of the reasons that I even became attracted to Islam, was because I felt that there were a lot of qualities or a lot of teachings in Islam and principles in Islam that really coincided with a lot of the teachings of martial arts. So I still practice to this day as much as I can, and but going back to that dramatic change in life. I was training before the main events, the main tournaments, and I went to an amateur tournament, and I remember I was winning, doing as I always do, kicking everyone's butts, and I got to the last match of the tournament, and I was winning, and a freak accident happened, and as I was going in for the final point, the guy slipped, and I don't know how to really explain this, but he slipped and his front foot came up, so his heel came up and hit me right in the jaw and snapped my neck back. And as it snapped back, I could hear the crack in my neck. And at that moment, I knew something was wrong because my entire body went numb. Prior to it going numb, though, I ended up knocking the guy out, thank God. Well, maybe not for him, but for me, it was good because I won. But as I hit him in the face and he went down for the count, I remember stumbling back and becoming extremely dizzy. And then all of a sudden, everything went silent. And I just dropped to the ground and I couldn't move. I couldn't move at all. Later, I would learn that as I was rushed to the hospital and diagnosed, I later learned that I had ruptured a disc in my neck. And I was basically paralyzed for a very long time. I was given steroid shots and physical therapy until I was able to walk again. And this was for a few months, actually. And after that, the doctor told me I couldn't fight anymore. And this was a very big blow to me because, as I told you, martial arts, Taekwondo specifically, gave me a lot of courage, and it really molded who I was. And I didn't even want to go to school as a result of how good I was in this field, if you want to call it that. I was so good I was going to go professional eventually, and that all stopped that day. So I was my life kind of went up in the air again. And it was during this time as well that something else happened as I was recovering. My mother, God bless her, she basically got a disease called scleroderma. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decided to give her this test and her family a test through this disease. And it's kind of like cancer. And basically what it does is that it overproduces the cells that repair your body. So like if you get a cut or anywhere on your body or something, the cells come in and repair you, and that's how you have the scar tissue and things like this. So basically this disease, scleroderma, overproduces those things. And what happened as a result was that my mom's skin was tightening to such an extent that it was actually tearing itself and repairing itself over and over again. And her body was actually becoming cocooned in the sense that her hands are now permanently like this. Her hands were becoming so stretched or so tight that her hands became like this, and now they're permanently like this for the rest of her life. Like she can literally not move her fingers, and including her toes. And it got so bad that it started to go to her organs, and it started to tear her organs, so she started to bleed internally as a result of this disease. And it was during this time that I thought that my mother was going to die. And remember, I had just come out of recovery from this injury, and as I was watching my mother slowly die in front of me, my life, just everything exploded. Like I just couldn't take it anymore, and I went through like a total mental breakdown. I started to become, as a result of this, I started to lose my faith in God, in religion. I went through like this atheist phase, I guess you could call it. I hated everything to do with religion and God, and I became more of a juvenile delinquent. I started getting a lot more fights at school. I started to go after my former bullies. I used to go after. I went after them. Like I would follow them to the bathroom and beat them, to a pulp. I started getting suspended from school as a result of all of these things, and I started stealing and doing all sorts of things, and I was becoming like a juvenile delinquent. Okay, just a bad kid. And this is my way of coping with it. I don't know. I just didn't care anymore, And eventually, my mother did get treatment. Basically, she was one of these few test subjects chosen for a stem cell transplant, and this is when it was still relatively new. And she received a stem cell transplant, and she's survived, and she is still in remission today. Alhamdulillah, the disease has not come back, so thank God for that. But it was a trying time. It was a time when I really believed that I was going to lose my mom, and actually even prior to her becoming cured, my delinquency got to such a bad extent that I actually ended up going to jail for a little while because I got in a fight with a police officer, a physical altercation with a police officer. I don't know how I got out of that, to be honest with you. Like, I don't know how I got such a lenient punishment because I was only in jail for a little while and then I got out and I did like community service. Like, I don't know. I guess they thought I was actually a good kid and I was going through all these problems and they thought that I could better myself. And yeah, like I just for some reason I recovered from that. Like I didn't, suffer the major consequences for my behavior when I probably should have. And yeah, I mean, I got out of that, and it was during this time as well, and I forgot to mention that shortly after this period, I tried to go to college to sort of rebuild my life, and I didn't do very well because I just wasn't focused. I still hadn't recovered from all of that, from all that trauma and all that experiences, and I dropped out pretty early, like a year and a half into college. I dropped out, and I had a really bad GPA anyway. Like it was like a 2 point. God, what was it? It was very low. It was a low range 2 point something. I think it was like a 2.4, 2.5. I don't know. It was really bad, and I dropped out of college, and I just started working, and I was still trying to recover from all that, and I started to find religion again. So I went back to Christianity because my family was primarily Catholic. So, and I tried to rebuild my life through religion, and it helped me a lot, to be honest. And this is one of the reasons I really hate it when atheists like bash religion, because had it not been for that community and that the solitude that I got from religion, I probably wouldn't have rebalanced myself and gotten back on my feet. Because you remember, I came from a very dark place at this point, and it was the only thing that really put me back together, that helped me come back together. And I admit wholeheartedly that it wasn't really rational reasons that drew me back to Christianity or to God. It was a combination between my natural inclination towards belief in God to begin with, and just my need to be part of something greater than myself that really put me back on my feet. And I admit it was largely pragmatic. And you know what? Thank God for that. I really don't care if it was rational or not to anyone, because without it, I wouldn't have gotten back on my feet, and I needed it. So for all of you out there say, "Oh, it's so silly to be part of religion," you know what? Most of you had not even experienced half of what I've experienced, and I'm not even done with my story yet. So don't tell me what is irrational or wasn't rational, because it was very rational for me at that point in time, when I needed something like that in order to survive, because I was suicidal. I even at one point I tried to kill myself. I was unsuccessful, alhamdulillah, and all these horrible things had happened to me. So had it not been for that structure and that transcendent value that I could attach myself to, I probably wouldn't be here today. So make fun of it all as you will. It doesn't change the fact that it was beneficial. Okay, and it helped me a lot, and it's helped a lot of other people in worse situations than myself. That's why Alcoholics Anonymous and all these other groups, people who've gone through trauma, they require a religious foundation in order to get through things. Okay, that's why I largely find atheism to be rather pathetic, if not useless. because I don't see all these people attaching themselves to atheism or science, in order to solve their problems in life. Humans are spiritual animals, and you're never going to get rid of that part of them. What makes a human being is more than just the rational, and if you rob them of that, you're going to have a lot of messed up individuals. And so thank God, yes, thank God for religion during that time in my life, because without it, I'd be very, very, very messed up. I may not even be here. I may be dead. So, as I was trying to rebuild my life through Christianity, I eventually got things back on track, and I started to go back to school, to college. And you gotta remember, my GPA was really low. Okay, and because I dropped out and I had rejoined, and now I'm trying to to rebuild my GPA again. And at this point, another thing happened to me. I didn't mention earlier, I had a childhood friend who I considered a brother. Um, it was another traumatic experience. This person died. He died in a car wreck, and I knew his family since I was very young. And we were, like I said, we were like brothers, and his mom treated me like her own son. And I remember getting the news over the phone. His wife called me, and it was really hard because I didn't believe it at first, because he used to joke with me, like, actually, they used to do this to me before online. They used to send me messages and like, oh, Josh is dead, and I'm like, ha ha ha. And man, when I got that phone call, it hit me like a ton of bricks. That he passed away not too long after the phone call was made, or not. He got into this horrible car wreck, and it was just I remember I hung up the phone and I threw it against the wall, and I just started bursting into tears. And really, it was like I can't even express how I felt at that point in time, because I really loved that guy. I loved him like my brother, and he was my only sibling in my life, And I remember getting a plane ticket and going down there to his funeral, and to console his mom and his wife and everything. And I remember what his mother told me, and she was crying, and I know she was only saying it because she was sad, but it really made me reflect on my life. And I remember she told me, why did it have to be him? Why couldn't it have been you? Because you were the bad one. I remember she told that to me as she was crying, like because I was the bad one. He was a good kid, he was a good guy. And I was the delinquent, I was the one who got messed up later in life and did all these bad things. And he was always the good one. And that really hurt me. But, it made me think about my life, like, what had I done in the past, and how much I messed up, and how much I needed to be better than that, because, or for him, for him. The fact that, and I believed it myself, I believed that I was the one who should have died, not him. So that it was like an incentive after that for me to be better in life. And I remember I was one of the only non-family members to give a eulogy that day. And that was one of the toughest speeches I ever had to give in my life. It still is. Probably is the toughest speech I ever had to give in my life. And I remember having to stand there saying all the great things I loved about him, while remembering in the back of my mind that I was the one who was supposed to die, not him. But Allah took him and did not take me. Still don't know why to this day, but maybe there's a reason. So after that, I started to better myself even more, and took religion more seriously, and I decided to really take college more seriously as well. And eventually, I went to a private Catholic university where I obtained my degree in philosophy, Western philosophy. And the reason that I chose philosophy is because, actually, to be honest, it was a very superficial reason at first, is because I liked Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee was like my idol back then. And he was a philosophy major, so I thought, oh well, he was a great martial artist and he did philosophy, so I'll do it too. So that was really the reason, to be honest. It's kind of superficial, but I actually fell in love with the subject, so it was a good decision in the end. And I remember at the time I was an Orthodox Christian. I had joined the Orthodox Church because I got sick and tired of Catholicism and Protestantism, and I found a lot of errors in it. And during this period of time, as I was taking philosophy, I started to have doubts about my faith. I found that there were a lot of problems with Christianity that I just could not resolve, and one of the main doubts was with regard to the divinity of Christ, which didn't make any sense to me. It still didn't make any sense. Even in the Orthodox Church, it just was not explained to me in a how should I say, a sufficient fashion. For me, it was strange that a man could be God, could have limitations, yet at the same time be perfect, even though he was part of this Trinity. And what really got me eventually was, I think I was in an ethics course actually, and there was a friend of mine in there, or not, he wasn't my friend at the time, but there was a young Muslim man in that class who would eventually become one of my best friends. And he was a Shia Muslim. Okay, so he was Shia. And I didn't know the difference between Shia and Sunni at the time. It didn't really matter to me. And even though on a doctrinal level it does now, because I'm Sunni, I still consider him like a really good friend and, like a brother. So at the time I didn't really know the differences. And I remember he invited me over to his mosque, and, I accepted, and I went there. And I remember, man, being so impressed by his imam, which is like the head of the mosque. And he had studied in Iran and in Qom, and he was very well versed in philosophy, and he's very good at arguing. And I was so impressed that I kept coming back just to have discussions with this person, okay, for several months. And you know what? I eventually became convinced of Islam because of that individual. And I remember one thing he said to me was very fascinating, and I still remember it to this day. I remember he said to me, I don't care if you become Shia or Sunni. What I care about is if you become Muslim. And I remember that. And it was very, for me, that was a big deal because, I eventually did learn about the differences. And I remember talking to him how he would tell me how Sunniism is wrong and things like this, and et cetera, et cetera. But the fact that he was so open to me being whichever one, as long as I became a Muslim, to me that was really cool, and it helped me to kind of figure out to figure out my own journey after that. But eventually, I became intellectually convinced of Islam because an argument he proposed to me in a more basic fashion than how I understand it today. But it was basically like, how does the sacrifice of Jesus make any sense? And, first off, God is perfect in Christianity, right? And that means he can't change. But if Jesus is part of this Trinity, right, that means that at some point he was sacrificed. He died. Okay, that means that the Trinity became two, which means that God then changed. And if Jesus was not really an essential aspect of God, if he was just this accidental attribute, then how could you really call it a sacrifice? Because in order for something to be a sacrifice, you actually have to lose something, right? You actually have to give something up. And God can't technically give anything up, because if he did that, then he would change. He's perfect, so he can't lose anything, right? So this conundrum really bothered me for quite some time, and it eventually made me realize that Islam made more sense than Christianity. And one of the reasons that I chose Islam intellectually at this point was because, well, first off, I never had a problem with belief in God. I went through my atheist phase because of emotional issues at the time, psychological and emotional issues. But the concept of God never really felt incoherent to me or very irrational. It was always something that I felt naturally inclined towards, so I never had a problem with it. But it was really the religion surrounding the concept of God that really bothered me. And I felt that Islam was more coherent in comprehending the concept of God and religion in general. And then I eventually decided, okay, I don't want to be a Christian anymore, and I think I'll be a Muslim. But it took, even though I was intellectually convinced of that, it actually took more than that for me to eventually convert to Islam, believe it or not. I remember it was wintertime, and I was living in Chicago, and Chicago is really cold, okay, during winter. and it was snowing outside. It was like there was like almost a foot of snow outside at the time. And I remember a few weeks prior, I had ordered a Quran from this organization around the area, and they had finally shipped it to me. It was this very beautiful Quran, and actually I still have it. Actually, let me show it to you. Okay, here we go. So actually, this is my first Quran. It was given to me by Care. I don't know if you guys can see this. This Quran right here, believe it or not, this is my first Quran, and it was free, given to me in the mail. Okay, no wonder it took so much time for them to send it to me. Gorgeous Quran, beautiful, aesthetically very pleasing. And I remember reading it, and it was just so beautiful the way it was written and the way it looked, and I was just so enamored by the aesthetics. And one of the things I find about truth, to be honest, is not just about the rational aspects of it, but I also feel that truth is both also pragmatic and also aesthetically pleasing. Like truth cannot be ugly, and it cannot be useless in many ways. Like it has to have every feature. It has to be rationally coherent, it has to work, and it has to be beautiful. And these three things need to be put together to make to make truth. And it felt like in Islam, it felt like all these things together fit perfectly. And that's why I was really attracted to it intellectually. And it moved my heart. There were so many passages in the Quran that moved my heart, and especially with regard to my parents, because, like I said, I love my mother, my family in general, and she went through a lot for me. And I remember coming to the Quran, and I remember reading so many passages where it says to respect your parents because, they took care of you when you were young, and they bore the burden of you when you were young, and those passages made me cry, to be honest, because they really made me remember my mother and the struggle she went through for me, and what she sacrificed. And to this day, I'm still not perfectly respectful to my mother because, like I said, I grew up in the West, and in this part of the world, respect for parents is not a virtue, believe it or not. So it was not easy for me still to even conform to that standard, but it still touched at my heart because I felt there was such a level of truth there that it really affected the way that I perceived things. And I felt like the Quran was teaching me in many ways how to be a good person. And there were so many other passages in the Quran aside from that included the aspects of justice and fighting against those who fight you and things like this that really drew my attention to it. And it felt like a real message, like something from God that was really talking to me. It wasn't something that I was reading. It wasn't like a historical account that I was reading. It was actually something being spoken to me. And eventually, my heart was pretty set, but I was still scared because I knew that making this leap, remember 9/11 only happened, like I converted in 2008, so 9/11 only happened like 7 years ago, and that's not a long time. And there were still scares of terrorism and things like this, and I really didn't want to be part of a community where I was going to be an outcast because, like I said, my mom was protecting me from that for most of my life. But then eventually, one day I had this conversation with my grandma, and I told her, because I love my grandmother, I was very close to her as well, and she used to call me Prince, her Prince. She gave me my middle name too. She named me after the Archangel Michael, so she used to call me Prince Mikhail. Anyway, so my grandma, I was talking to her, and she's a staunch Catholic. She's probably the most religious person in my family. And I was talking to her about my journey to Islam and how I felt it was made sense. And I remember telling me something very interesting. She said, do you still believe in Jesus? And I said, yes, of course. No matter what, I'll still believe in Jesus. And she said, then I don't, then you can become whatever you want as long as you still believe in Jesus. I don't think she understood the implications of that in the Islamic perspective, but it was nice to hear from her. And I remember we got into this discussion where I was talking about Islam, and then she started talking about my ancestors. our ancestors. And I was really strange because I never heard her talk about it before. And she's like, my family came from Spain, and and their family was in Spain, and they used to believe in Jesus in a different way than we did, and they didn't believe he was. They believed he was a prophet, but they weren't Catholic, and and things like this. And I was like wondering, like, what are you talking about, Grandma? Why are you telling me this? And she didn't give me all the details, and she didn't know all the details herself, but it was very strange. So I thought, okay, well, let me try to figure something out. So I started going into our family history, and our Spanish last name is Rosario, so that's something for you to know. And Rosario, I didn't know the meaning of that at the time, so I started looking back and back, and I found that our name, our last name, didn't really go farther than 500 years, and I tried to figure out why. And I went down this rabbit hole where I eventually figured out that, and to cut a story short here, is that my ancestors were Moriscos, which means that they were people who were forcibly converted to Catholicism by the European Spanish, and they were converted to Catholicism from Islam. So they were originally Muslims. Rosario was a name that was given to them, and what Rosario means is that it's basically the Spanish name for tasbih, okay, which is like the beads that are used to make dhikr. All right, so, and because my family was also from the southern province of Andalusia, I mean, it all came together. I mean, basically, I found out that my ancestors were Muslims from my grandma's information, from my lineage, from looking at the the names and everything. I found out that my ancestors were Muslims, and this really gave me the final push to convert, and I did. And I chose a name for myself. I chose to name myself Ali, in accordance with my new identity. And the reason I chose a new name was because I wanted to move away from the fact that my mom had given me my name because she wanted to hide who I was. She wanted to protect me, but I didn't want to be protected anymore. I wanted to choose who I was and what my path was, so I chose my name as Ali. And this is the name that I went by for quite some time. And for those of you who want to know why I'm also called Asadullah, that's a different story. But to make it brief, I had a friend in university by the name of Hamza, and me and Hamza used to walk into the masjid together. And the sheikh was there. He used to call us the two lion cubs because we're about the same age, a little older than him, but. And the sheikh looked at me and he said, "But your name is not a lion," because Hamza also means lion. So he gave me the name Asadullah as a result of that. So that's why I go by Asadullah Ali. Okay, so that's the story in a nutshell. So Ali was a name chosen by myself, which my friends mostly called me, and Asadullah was a name given to me by my first sheikh, and it's something that's just kind of stuck with me as a result. Since then, and I converted to Sunniism. So I've been Sunni for most of my conversion, since and I've been Muslim for 10 years now, so since 2008. And there's a lot more to the story than this too. I mean, I could go on and on. Actually, there was a point in time where actually I became homeless because when I became Muslim, my parents and we had such a disagreement because like I said, my mom was very overprotective, but we had such a disagreement that I eventually had to move out of the house, and I was homeless for about a year. And I remember that was a very hard time for me as well because like I had nowhere to go. I was living out of my car, and eventually like the Muslim community there allowed me to stay in the Musalla, a small mosque on campus. And I was actually living on the Musalla, and I was taking showers in the gyms and everything like this. And I remember I was so poor at one point that I had this one brother I loved to death for the sake of Allah who used to buy me like pizzas and things like this. And eventually me and my family reconciled, and I eventually moved back in, and things were fine. They still to this day don't agree with my conversion, but they're more accepting now. Everything's cool. And a lot of other things happened, and then I joined this one group, this dawah organization in Chicago, and eventually I decided, after my degree, I want to go study Islam. but from my also incorporated with my degree. So I still want to do philosophy, but Islam. So I decided to go to Malaysia. I did a lot of research, and I decided to go to Malaysia. And I'm trying to get the story done now because it's getting kind of long. But I remember applying to the Islamic University in Malaysia, and then I got accepted, and then I went there. So after 3 years of being a convert in the United States, I eventually went to Malaysia. And thank God for that, because when I was in the U.S., it was very difficult as a Muslim at the time, as a new convert. And like I said, I endured a lot of difficulties with being homeless and also prejudice from other individuals, and it was not easy at all. It was during this time as well that I was active online and YouTube, and prior to going to Malaysia. And I remember being very zealous in my faith, and I got into a lot of issues, and I know a lot of you are aware of this drama, but I was slandered quite badly after responding to somebody, and I was basically called a terrorist and things like this. And I remember going through that. That was really hard for me because I'd never suffered prejudice like that before. It was so bad, and that really shaped the way that I viewed people online after that. Because I never, in my day when I was growing up, if you insulted people, if you wanted to be like that, you were looking for a fight, and people didn't hide behind computer screens. You know what I mean? Nowadays, you have a bunch of people hiding behind computer screens, doing whatever they want, hurting people as much as they want without consequence. And I'd never dealt with those sort of people before. These cowardly, effeminate men who think that they're all tough because they can hide behind a computer screen and harass you constantly. Like, I never dealt with that before, and it was just really weird. And it really bothered me. It really affected me a lot, and the whole internet and rise of YouTube really negatively affected me in the beginning of my life as a Muslim. And eventually I moved to Malaysia, and I remember that experience in the US and online really having a really negative impact on me. And I remember as a result of that really having sort of a crisis of faith, after 3 years, and becoming more liberal as a result of that. And it was during this time, during this liberal phase of my faith, that I started to attach myself to very narrow-minded or very narrow purposed groups, Muslim groups. So, for example, I joined this, I considered like a radical Sufi group while I was in Malaysia, called the Murabitun. And I still agree with some of their ideas, but it was kind of a revolutionary group, and it was focused on like a lot of economic issues and things. It wasn't a violent group by any means, but it had a very narrow interpretation of Islam, and I attached myself to that to kind of help me to, I don't know, you know what I mean, like to get me back on my feet, I guess, like I did before with my other when I was going through my juvenile delinquent phase. I felt that would be a means to get my identity back. And I remember the sheikh that I attached myself to was also Spanish, so I felt that there was some connection there. And I remember this was like the first time in my journey in Islam that I actually felt disdain and hatred for non-Muslims, like for the first time. And I'm going to be straight with you guys. It had nothing to do with me reading the Quran or the Hadith. Had absolutely nothing with me reading the source material of Islam. It had everything to do with my past experience with non-Muslims and all of the prejudice and hate that I went through dealing with all these non-Muslims, especially online. That was really what encouraged me to feel that hatred. So I always think it's really weird when people are like, well, terrorists and extremists, they read the Quran and the Hadith, and then they magically they want to hate non-Muslims. They want to go Allahu Akbar and go kill some non-Muslims. It's like, no, that's not what happens. Let me tell you, my hatred for non-Muslims at that point in my life, as a Muslim, didn't stem from Islam at all. It was just me being a Muslim and having an Islamic identity and having experienced all that hatred and vulgarity and disgusting behavior that I started to hate. That's the reason. And I can tell you with a lot of confidence that people who went farther than I did, who actually became real extremists, like people who went and killed people, they had very similar sentiments. And you're probably wondering, well, did you stop hating non-Muslims? And I did. I did eventually stop, and it took a long time, to be honest. Not very long, maybe a year. Uh, and it actually happened around the time ISIS came into existence, because I wanted to know what ISIS was about. Like, why were they rising to power and things like this? And I started researching ISIS, and I started researching what their source materials, because they wrote a lot of things in their propaganda magazines, and I wanted to see like what, you know, if they were teaching was true or not. So I started to actually go through all their source text, and I started to find a lot of contradictions, and I started to realize that this is not what Islam teaches. Islam does not teach you to hate, and Islam does not teach you to kill indiscriminately and things like this. And then I started seeing the actions of ISIS, and it really disgusted me. You know, like, this cannot be Islam at all. And I started to question myself a lot in that respect, in terms of how I viewed non-Muslims after that. And really, the straw that broke the camel's back was that I knew this young boy when I was back in Chicago, and when I was working for this dawah organization. He was the son of one of my colleagues, and he was like a young kid at the time. Like, he was really young. Like, he wasn't even a teen at that, or maybe he was. He was a young teen, and he was a good kid, quiet, good kid. And my friend calls me up one day from over there in Chicago, and he tells me, "Hey, you remember that kid? I'm not going to mention his name." I said, "Yeah." He's like, I regret to inform you that, I was shocked, but man, he just got caught at the border. He got caught at the airport, excuse me, trying to join ISIS, and he was like 17 at the time. And I remember when he told me that, and my heart literally like sunk. Like, I could not believe, and I had learned all these horrible things about ISIS at the time, and this kid, this good kid that I knew, who wouldn't have hurt a fly, and I've seen him so many times before. He was such a good, he was a quiet, decent kid, did well, really good in school and things. I don't know why he had this. Maybe something he experienced in his youth, maybe the same type of hatred that I experienced, he experienced, and it just drove him over the edge. And he was younger, he was more rambunctious, he's a teen, and he just made a stupid decision, and now he ruined his life, and it really hurt me. And at that point in time, I had gotten my degree in Islamic study, or not Islamic study, but Islamic philosophy. And I decided, you know what, I'm not going to study any more of the mystical elements. I'm not going to study about atheism anymore. I'm not going to study all this stuff. You know what, I want to study something that's going to help the world more. And I decided to get into counterterrorism. And I applied to the University of Malaya, and I applied to the Islamic Studies department, where I studied extremism and minored in counterterrorism. And this is when I started my PhD. And at this point in time in my life, I started to take all my analytical skills and all my learning and apply them to trying to help people. And through this, I started to balance myself, and I started to really set myself straight in such a way that not only was I now comfortable with my new identity, with my actual identity as a Muslim, but now there was no longer a crisis of faith. I started to become, balanced. This is the best word to use. And it was at this point in time that I also got married, and I met the love of my life at school, at the same university that I was attending prior. And, she's been a wonderful support for me and encouragement, throughout my life. And, without her, I don't know what I'd do either. She really has been there for me through all my ups and downs since we've been married. And she's really helped me along that journey as well. And, eventually, after staying in Malaysia for quite some time, I decided to finally come back. And I have been back to the United States since 2017. And now I'm working with Yaqeen Institute, and I'm still on my mission to help the Muslim world and the Muslim youth from being not only attracted to extremism, but also the pitfalls of atheism and other bad ideologies. And I also do counter-Islamophobia studies and everything else. And basically, now I'm here. Okay. I have been Muslim since 2008. So this is my 10 years as a Muslim. I have been a Muslim for a decade. And wow, time has gone by so quickly. And I know I've talked for a long time now, and I'm really sorry. I've tried to make it as brief as possible. But I hope you guys understand a little bit more about me as a result of this short biography. There are a lot more details that I left out and, could make up, hour-long supplementary videos, but I don't really want to get into those. But that's generally my story in a nutshell, and I really hope that you guys have benefited from it somewhat, and that you kind of understand me more now, and that you know where I'm coming from and where I'm going. I'm still growing as a Muslim. I'm still learning as a Muslim. I'm still trying to be a better Muslim. I'm still recovering from a lot of things that happened in my life, but this is who I am now, and I'm hoping that eventually I will be used as a tool for the sake of this ummah, that I will become something that can help this ummah, and that, I'll be remembered for sacrificing something for this ummah, for being something for this ummah, and that Allah will be pleased with me, and I that's all I really hope for now. And my enemies are numerous. They're still there. They're still out to get me. And I anticipate that they will continue to slander and try to harm me as much as possible throughout my life, because I have become a Muslim and because I am fighting them. But I will tell you this right now, because of all the horrible things that I've gone through in my life, because of all the challenges and the obstacles, I'm going to tell you right now, I'm ready for it. I'm ready for it, and I'm still willing to move forward and to give up my life for the sake of this community, for the sake of this ummah, for the sake of the Muslims and the youth. And I don't mean give up my life like I'm going to go martyr myself. I know people are going to try to quote mine this video as much as possible and try to harm me. But I mean that I'm willing to give up my own aspirations in terms of my own desires and things like this in order to benefit this community. And I think I've been through enough, and I've experienced enough to know it's the right thing to do. To finally say to myself, I don't need much in life. I don't desire much in life. And this is what I want for myself and for my legacy. So I only ask for your prayers, and I ask you all to make dua for me and to simply ask Allah to elevate me, to make me something useful for all of you. And no matter how much more I will suffer in the future, and no doubt I will, please pray that I'll be able to endure. And thank you once again for listening. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.